This evening, we're going to be joined by Megan Kimball, who's the executive editor of the Texas Observer. She has a piece that was published jointly by The Nation and the Texas Observer this month that focuses on the overlooked topic of highway removal. Megan, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. So talk a little bit about what highway removal it is exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of tearing down highways, specifically in urban areas. So listeners might know that in 1956, the Federal Highway Act dedicated an enormous amount of money to building the interstate highway system. And many of those interstates were built through urban areas, predominantly Black and Hispanic communities that had been redlined a decade earlier by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the Federal Highway Act did a lot of harm in urban areas to Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, cutting them in half. Almost 500,000 people lost their homes over the decade after the Federal Highway Act passed. Fast forward 50 years, many of those highways are now reaching the end of their sort of planned lives. So they're reaching functional obsolescence. They're cracking, they're kind of tearing down. Something needs to be done about these highways. And so what state departments of transportation are doing is saying, hey, let's rebuild them, and our cities are growing, so let's build them back wider and higher. And that's a bad reason for lots of reasons, which we can talk about later, but kind of data shows that that doesn't actually fix traffic. You expand a highway and cars will rush to fill it up. So what advocates kind of across the country are asking is, what if we tore down those urban highways and figured out a way to get people around differently, invest the billions and billions of dollars that we're going to invest in highways and transit and alternate forms of transportation in our cities specifically.
And your story has some real eye-popping numbers that I hadn't really thought about until I saw those. In other words, if these highways are running through major urban areas, which of course they are, and they're taking up this massive amount of cumulative space, that if you remove those and replace them with residential homes, with apartments, with retail, the kind of economic boom and the property tax boom to the cities was just extraordinary. I think the first question, kind of like a normie would ask, would be like, okay, well then, how do we get home?
Yeah, what happens to traffic? That's what everyone asks, right? And that's a really good question. And studies have shown that if the kind of thing that I was mentioning earlier, when you widen the highway, cars will come fill it up. Traffic engineers call that induced demand. You make it cheaper, easier to access, more people will use it. Well, the same can also be true. People have argued that if you make it harder for people to drive, fewer people will drive. They will change their behavior. They will get around differently. And so essentially, a lot of discretionary trips will disappear if you tear down a highway that a lot of people have been using. You can make it easier for people to get around by transit. So the sort of famous example is in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake destroyed the Embarcadero Freeway. And so for a while, for a few years, it was useless. It couldn't be used. And so city leaders were trying to figure out what to do with it. And there was this sort of predicted Carmageddon. There were going to be these huge traffic jams in San Francisco. And they simply didn't materialize. People maneuvered around it. Bus ridership increased 15%. And people didn't take trips that maybe they didn't need to take. Didn't go to the store maybe twice a week, they went once a week. So a lot of traffic simply evaporates. Our surface grid of streets can absorb a lot more traffic than people think it can. And that's what's been sort of studied in Dallas more specifically. So traffic is definitely a big question, but I think that studies have shown that these sort of crazy traffic jams simply don't materialize.
Where have they successfully done this, and what's been the result?
Yeah, so most recently, Rochester tore down half of their inner loop in 2017, and the city is now considering tearing down the rest of it. And there, what they found is, the land that was liberated from this highway has created infill housing, affordable housing. So there've been a lot of community benefit created from this land. That's a highway that was not being used to full capacity, whereas some of the highways in Texas that I talk about in my story, are absolutely at capacity. The highway in Dallas that I mentioned, I-345. has been studied in terms of how much land that impacts. And it's in my story, I cite a study that someone there has done at 245 acres. And so that's an enormous amount of sort of development potential in the core of downtown Dallas, which is, the 9th most populous city in the country, that's sort of been assumed by this highway that could potentially be turned over for property tax revenue. So Milwaukee also removed part of their highway downtown, and a similar thing happened. It took a little bit longer, but development has eventually come to that area.
So what do people think about this in Dallas? Are they able to get their head around the idea? Like once they get over their fear and see, wait a minute, we could have, instead of this ugly highway here that is miserable to be on anyway, we could actually develop this into something that would be useful for the city. Is that appealing enough to people in Dallas to get it taken seriously, or is there so much fear around? Well, my goodness, how will we ever get anywhere?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. I mean, there is certainly business owners and property developers understand the economic potential. So does the city, the property tax base that could be created from all this development. There's a lot of revenue that could be generated that could then go to community benefit like parks or community land trusts or affordable housing. I think because Dallas is so much a city built around the car, a lot of people are hesitant. Hey, you're going to cut off this channel of access to my job. So in South Dallas is where many people, lower income people and people of color live. In North Dallas is where many of the jobs are. And so I was up there for a community meeting last month, and a lot of people said, hey, you're going to cut off my access to my job. Like, that's sort of an insult to me when you sort of redlined us to these neighborhoods half a century ago.
Right. So what do you do about that? Because that's a real thing. Like we've pushed you out of the city. A lot of cities have this. They push everyone who makes a low wage far away from the city center, and then force them to come back into the city center to work those low wage jobs. So what was there anything satisfactory that could be said to those workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of two things. The first is the state of Texas is planning to spend $25 billion over the next few years expanding highways. Think of how much transit could be built with $25 billion. So that's a really great way to get people to work, which is actually a cheaper way to get to work. Owning a car is incredibly expensive. So that's sort of a kind of a short-term fix. A longer-term fix is thinking about how do we use and develop that land. So turning it over to a community land trust, which creates permanently affordable housing by separating the ownership of a structure from the land, putting that land in community control, managed by a nonprofit. And you could bring people back closer to the center of the city. Those who want to move, who want to be closer to the core of the city. You could give them that opportunity through community land trust or any kind of other community benefits agreement. And that's proposition.
Why wouldn't the public transit take up as much space as the highway?
Well, people take up fewer space than cars, right? So when you're in your car, you're taking up 8 square feet of space. When you're a person on a train, you take up far fewer space. So there's actually a really good graphic that kind of urbanists love to tweet about, 50 people on a highway takes up a whole stretch of highway, and you can clump those people together, and it's just a really small area that you could fit in a bus. And so moving people by transit is just a much more efficient way to move people around, especially in crowded cities where space is at a premium.
Right. What about Austin? What's being contemplated there?
Right, so I-35 is our big interstate that goes through the middle of Austin. TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation, has released plans that show an expansion. It's currently a 12-lane highway. They want to make it 20 lanes, so an expansion of 8 lanes. Some of those would be tunneled and buried, so it wouldn't increase footprint. We don't know how much it's going to increase the footprint, actually. TxDOT's current proposal, there are community groups here who are advocating there are two sort of different visions. One's to tear out the highway completely and create a boulevard and route a lot of the interstate traffic to the eastern edge of the city. And then the other one is to sort of effectively tunnel the highway, creating a cap over most of central Austin and making a surface boulevard that people could bike on and walk across and have buses on. So those are the sort of two community proposals. The question is whether or not TxDOT is going to take them seriously.
So you also write in your piece about how, starting from the premise that black and mostly black, but black and brown communities were devastated by highway construction throughout the 50s and 60s, and then you ask the question, well, how do we make sure that this is done in a way so that those communities are not left out? And so how consciously and how intentionally is this being taken? Is that where a lot of affordable housing proposals come from? I mean, what can be done? Because it does look like there's a risk that you could see this end up with sort of like a hipster playground, and we would say, well, that's nice, it's better than a highway, but man, it's kind of gross.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a way that this just benefits money developer interests who are already in city cores. And so I think having that reparative justice, I mean, people are talking about turning land back over to the communities who were originally harmed as a form of reparation. So that word has come up in conversations with people who are considering highway removals. And that's where I think the sort of the ownership of that land and what happens to that land, the people who were originally displaced, who may live far away in the suburbs, but they need to be at the table and they need to have an ownership stake in what happens to that and actually benefit from its removal.
Well, Megan Campbell, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation. Really interesting story, really interesting idea.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.